So let's go look at that biomed text. There it is, slightly reformatted. So the first thing we can kind of, in terms of situating the text, we could think in terms of genres. So we could draw on Nessie and Gardner's genre families, I think is what they termed it. This is an explanation. It's high informational, so a lot of density there in terms of knowledge, ideas. Rose would term it a compositional report, so we can see sort of definite moves between classification and description. And we can see that in the sort of rightmost column, there's lots there that is, lots of work there in classifying things. From a cognitive genre perspective, Bruce might sort of, refer to it as a report, presenting information non-sequentially. And that gives us some key tools to kind of begin to identify certain moves. So, for example, in the report, sort of rhetorical purpose, Bruce kind of, points to the fact that this is very often, it follows the discourse pattern of preview details. So, we started to get a sense of the textual sort of makeup of a text like this. And then another thing that, clearly comes through is it's all about classification and composition. So this is what Doran and Martin might term as static perspective. It's that sort of substantive knowledge. What is this thing we're looking at? What's it made up of? And all the rest of it. So genre would obviously be a key discourse knowledge thing that we would have in our toolkit. So understanding genres, understanding how they're structured, what's happening inside them would be obviously really important. But of course, another tool we thought would be interesting would be, looking at that from a textual perspective. So we've kind of focused on discourse semantics and the different elements of that. So, for example, here we see very clear move between, say, a macro and a hyper theme. Underlined within those paragraphs are the topic themes. So, kind of being able to read this particular text to learn, it requires, sort of identifying how that's all organized. Another possible perspective that could help us uncover some of the features of a text like this would be taking a transitivity angle at it. So those of you who are familiar with SFL transitivity, we're looking at things like participants and clauses, processes, as well as circumstantial stuff. So in this one, we can see, very much in terms of the verbs, the processes, it's very relational. There's a lot of relational verbs coming through in there. Okay, so there are some we've sort of touched on that we thought might be interesting. I guess for a student to really read that to learn, they would have to put all those ideas together. So they would, all of that kind of the discourse semantics, the sort of processes, the way it's all organized. If a student could manage that, they would probably come up with some sort of representation there, which indicates just how dense the challenge for them is really quite significant in terms of reading to learn. Another sort of tool we thought might be useful would be thinking of it in terms of semantic density. So Matten and Doran have kind of presented this sort of translation device looking at epistemic condensation. So how dense certain pieces of a text could be and what contributes to that. So I think in terms of clausing, if we look at that, we can see it's kind of way up there on the top. It's really dense, which kind of speaks to Nessie and Gardner's, a high informational content kind of idea. So with these tools, we begin to get a much clearer idea of what's going on in the text and what types of insights or tools we could draw on. So in this one, semantic density certainly could help us uncover or get us thinking about what we would use or focus students on in that text and what follow-up activities could be, getting them to explore, play around a little bit with meaning so they can get that sort of practice as well. So if we flick over to the Introduction of Sciences text, there it is. Now, as I said earlier, the text is actually doing almost the same thing from a genre perspective, exactly the same. So it's an explanation, high informational, compositional report, according to Rose. So we've got lots of classification, description, and it's from a cognitive genre perspective, doing exactly the same thing. So there's a lot there, in terms of genre, it's actually the same from a genre perspective. But of course, there's a lot of interesting stuff. It looks very different. So a teacher, looking at a text like this and trying to draw out the sort of nuances of what makes that text and that subject area different would be interesting. So of course, we can go to transitivity and focus on processes again. Immediately we see a shift, whereas in the biomed text it was mostly relational. This one we see a lot more verbal, mental processes coming through. So that would be interesting to notice and perhaps get students to focus on. Also, in terms of appraisal, those of you familiar with appraisal theory, SFL, it can kind of focus on graduation of meanings, attitude, or engagement. Engagement being how different voices are brought in. So for this particular one, I think engagement is really interesting. And we can see how in this text, we've got reference, to for some people, for others, as many as we've got different voices coming in, or people, knowers, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, John Rawls, and trying to situate all of these within the context of these movements, if you like, is quite tricky. I was recently working on a text, Law and Society, and sort of we were looking at that and trying to understand, I think it was the Contagious Diseases Act and the Marriage and Property Acts of late 19th, early 20th centuries, and trying to figure out all the different players and exactly what their positions were and how those positions differ slightly, the nuances between them, is really quite tricky. And yet students would be expected to identify those in text. So that sort of focusing on engagement could certainly be an interesting exercise. So again, appraisal as another toolkit, which we think would be useful. And then we got, again, discourse semantics, the sort of textual nature of the text. Again, we see the sort of macro kind of hyper themes, a little bit of, I think that's probably, what do we call that, meronymy, sort of part whole kind of relationships, which is, obviously something students would need to articulate and how they do that, or first identify, I guess, when they're reading to learn. So a lot going on there. So although the text is doing the same thing from a genre perspective, we begin to see the knowledge practices coming through, if we begin to use other tools to kind of get a clearer idea of what's going on. And then again, if we look at the semantic density in that particular one, although it is kind of talking about classification, we don't see much of that language at the clausal level. It's kind of veering down towards the more verbal mental action at the bottom of that black triangle. That kind of stuff comes through a lot more. So there's a definite shift to slightly lower levels of semantic density in terms of clausing, I think we could probably say. All right. So again, looking at two texts that are from a genre perspective the same, but digging into them using other sort of angles or perspectives to really get to the sort of, I don't know, is it the knowledge practices of what's going on in that from us? And we're talking from, the perspective of substantive knowledge. We're not into the disciplinary stuff yet. Let's move into the disciplinary stuff because that becomes interesting. So history of art, we thought it would also be interesting to really get a sense for what really successful students are doing with language within their subject units. So that was a question which took me quite a while to get my head around. So I presume students are a little bit quicker than I am at figuring out what that's asking. But again, looking at a student sample, so there's a student sort of response or a sample, a part of a student response to that question. And again, we can begin to sort of, try and understand it from a genre perspective. It's an essay. So not quite as high informational as the previous text we looked at in Biomed. Say, for example, slightly more narrative focused. It's a discussion for Bruce. So the image schema is very much one of containers. That argument could be kind of conceptualized as being broken into containers. And then, of course, the discourse patterns that come out of those containers, we see a very nice example there, that sort of generalization followed by an example of what we're trying to talk about. So in this case, an example of work that I think it was Frida Kahlo, that she had done, and explaining how that piece of work exemplifies a particular meanings or that sort of stuff. So again, genre really sort of gives us quite a bit of insight into that. We could also look at transitivity again. So from a register perspective, again, looking at the processes, there are a lot of mental processes there. So it should be seen as, it appears. So we see a particular way of kind of communicating ideas coming through, implying can be noticed. There's also a lot of circumstantial stuff we found in these sort of texts. So successful students are really good at making visible the context, the people, who they are, where they're from, when they're from, and how that all feeds into, what was happening at that particular time, which is obviously very important, an important thing to be doing. So genre transitivity, semantic gravity, I think most people are familiar with that. I think what's interesting is if we use some of these tools, we're essentially talking about the same thing. So Bruce's, discourse pattern generalization, to example, that's how semantic gravity is shifting, from a more abstract to a more concrete, contextualized sort of, meanings. And then there's one more. You're probably feeling quite exhausted by now, I don't know, but we will wrap this up. There's one more which I think is really important when we get into the disciplinary kind of knowledge, which is what LCT is referred to as grammaticality. So there's a very nice example there. Now, Luckett kind of explores this. So if you're interested in it, I would recommend you go and look at her work. It's quite fascinating, I think. But really what we're talking about is how theories deal with the world and what happens in that space between when we talk about a theory and we refer to empirical data. So when students are making that move, what's going on in that space and what's interesting. And I think Luckett sort of alludes to three possible areas that are interesting. And I think our student example here sort of, speaks to all three of them. In a sense, the student is defining, how Frida Kahlo should be kind of seen, what type of an artist was she. There's definite classification there. She should be seen as a feminist. I guess others, other people might see it as a postmodern or perhaps post-colonial or whatever. So there are different classifications going on. And there's also a claim there, all kind of hedged. And it's that sort of hedging that we see a lot, going on in this text when we looked at the sort of mental processes. There were verbs that were very much presenting ideas, not as facts, but as perspectives or possibilities, perhaps more. I think in terms of trying to understand what discourse knowledge would be useful in terms of trying to understand, and again,